Hello, friends and enemies, heroes and villains. Welcome to Epic Realms. Today's guest is a master of many trades, award winning games, New York Times bestseller. He's a writer, an author, and designer. Welcome, Matt Forbeck, to Epic Realms. How are you doing?
Doing great. Thanks for having me on.
I am so glad you're here. You know, some people ask what came first, the chicken or the egg? But for you, what came first, like writing or game design?
That's a tough question. I started out obviously as a kid wanting to be a writer, right? I did some writing when I was in high school and stuff, but I got into game design so quickly at such a young age, like about 13, that that really quickly took over a lot of my creative efforts. The trick, of course, is this is in the 80s, and in those days, the idea that somebody could make a living as a game designer was kind of ridiculous, right? But I happened to be fortunate enough to grow up in southern Wisconsin, where I was only about 40 minutes away from Lake Geneva, which is where Dungeons and Dragons was started and originally published by TSR way back in the day. So because of that, I was able to start going to conventions when I was like 13 years old, and run around doing a whole bunch of stuff like that. And I would just drive up the road, literally from my house to the place. And eventually, I started playtesting games with some of the other ex-TSR designers, like Troy Denning and Steve Sullivan and Gally Sanchez, et cetera, Andre Hayday. They formed a company called Pace Setter, which did Chill and Rabbit's Revenge and Star Ace and a bunch of other games. And they invited me up to start playtesting games with them in the evening. So I would come up once a week to playtest games after soccer practice.
Oh, wow.
Um, and getting involved with those folks. And then they introduced me to a guy named Will Niebling, who was the ex vice president of TSR, and actually famously got ousted and then sued them for a stock option and won something like $1.5 million. Good guy. And he kind of mentored me into doing this games design stuff when I was in college. And I've been doing it ever since. I got out of college and went and worked for Games Workshop on a student work visa.
Okay.
Basically, I wanted to go over to UK, and I wanted to go over to Europe and visit a friend of mine in Spain. I didn't have any money at all, and I didn't have any way to get over there. I didn't know anybody in the entire hemisphere other than that one kid in Spain. But I managed to land a student work visa for the closest country to Spain, of which I spoke the language, which I also spoke Spanish, but they didn't have that. Um, but it happened to be they didn't have a work visa program, so I ended up in the UK, and I just called up Games Workshop and said, "Hey, you guys hiring? I saw an ad in White Dwarf," and they're like, "Sure, come on in." So, and believe it or not, landed a job, and 6 months later, they offered me a full-time position. Um, and I turned it down because my girlfriend at the time was like, "Well, it's one thing to be away for 6 months. It's another thing to be away permanently." And she still was finishing up college. Um, I'm like, yeah, you're right. This is all the days before FaceTime, before email, even honestly.
Yeah,
We were
yeah.
actually writing letters with stamps on them and stuff. And so I came back. I came back on Valentine's Day, 1990, to be with that girl. That's now my wife. Will be 30 years this year, and mother of my 5 children. So
That's
worked out
awesome.
pretty good. It was a good choice.
Good
So,
decision, yeah.
yeah.
And you still in the end ended up working doing games.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't stop me, obviously. So, who knows? I mean, if I'd stuck around with Games Workshop, well, a lot of the guys I know that are not there anymore, like Rick Priestley and Nigel Stillman and such have moved on. Lindsay Priestley is still working there, I believe, in the Black Library, which is their fiction department. But the people I knew who are running the company have moved on to other things. So I either would have done that at some point, or I would have wound up running the company. But who the hell knows? I'm not. Tom Kirby was the guy who was running it after Brian Ansell when I was there, and he was doing a bang up job. But that was many years ago. Even then, Tom's been gone for a while.
So when did you start writing novels?
Well, I wrote a really terrible one in college, right?
Okay.
And then immediately put it away where nobody could ever see it ever again. So
Do you still
um,
have it?
I do, and I think one of my kids busted it out once and just laughed and laughed. And like, now you're never seeing that again. Forget it. And so what happened though is I always wanted to write novels, so I knew that Games Workshop and TSR at the time, which was just being purchased by Wizards, they had novel departments. So I would approach their novel editors, so they were friends of friends at least, and sometimes I
Yeah.
actually knew them. I'd say, "Hey, I can write that," and they're like, "Well, it's nice that you think that," right? Because even though I had written millions of words at this point for both of those companies, the trick is that telling somebody you can write a novel is kind of like saying, I can run a marathon. It's like, yeah, technically maybe you could, but seeing as how you never have, maybe done more than a quarter mile in your life, you might want to, prove that first before we give you a contract. So,
Right.
um, so they were like, oh, no, we can't do that. I'm like, oh, man. And I was griping about it at a convention. I think it was Gamma Trade Show or something like that. I'm like, man, if these guys would just give me a chance, I've already written all this stuff. I know this stuff backwards and forwards. And, but they want to see a published work, and I can't show them my college novel because that would eliminate me entirely.
Right.
Right. And Ed Pugh from Reaper Miniatures was listening. I think he was across the table, or maybe at the bar, or right next to me at the bar. He said, "Oh, what's that, man? I'll hire you to write a novel." I'm like, "Oh, really?" So Ed Pugh hired me to write a 40,000 word, very short novel based on Combat Assault Vehicle (CAV), which is their giant fighting mech game, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And he's like, "Here, 40,000 words, nickel a word, go." And I'm like, okay. So I wrote it like crazy, turned it into him. He FedExed me a check without even looking at the file. He just saw that it showed up in his email box and said, "Here you go, Matt, here's your money." Like within months, it was printed and out because they're a game company, not a big novel publishing company.
Right.
So they can do that kind of stuff and get away with it. And then I was able to turn around literally at that Gen Con and say to Games Workshop and Wizards of the Coast, I said, "Hey, look. And they're like, "Hey, good. Let me see." Yes, that's a real honest to God novel. And they actually literally sent me contracts after that. So
Nice.
it was because they knew I already knew the background, everything else in the worlds and all that kind of stuff. They knew I was easy to work with. I could hit deadlines and all that. I just needed to prove to them that I could string together, thousands of words into a story that people were willing to read and pay for.
Right.
And once I did that, they're like, "Sure." So I ended up writing. I pitched a bunch of books to Games Workshop, and I pitched a bunch of books to well, it was originally TSR. They hired me on to write a series. They had this thing called the Iconic series that were written by a house named T.H. Lane.
Okay.
And I was going to be one of those. And then that line got canceled and the company got got bought by Wizards of the Coast. So the next thing I know, they're like, "Well, what about something else?" And I ended up writing a trilogy, their first trilogy of chapter books they ever did, called The Knights of the Silver Dragon.
Mm-hmm.
And I created the series. I wrote the first book in the series, and then I wrote the last two, and there was like 14 total. So, but other authors came in and built upon what I created for that, which was kind of cool.
Yeah.
And then for Games Workshop, Mark Gascon, who had been working at Games Workshop when I was there, technically actually hadn't been working, he'd been laid off. And I met him in a bar. I think it was Yield Solicitation, which was just around the corner from Low Pavement at the design studio we're at. And Mark said, "Hey, why don't you pitch me some stuff?" So I sent him like 10 one-paragraph ideas. And, he looked them up and down, and he picked the one I thought, this is just a joke. There's no way this is ever going to happen, right? It's just toss it in there for fun because I like this stuff. And he says, "How about that Blood Bowl one?" I'm like, "You're kidding, right?" He's like, "No, develop that. Turn it into a pitch." I'm like, "Oh, fine. Okay." So I wrote like a 1-page thing, and he's like, "Oh, that's great, actually. Give me an outline." "Okay, here's your outline." "Great. We're signing you on for a trilogy of novels." I'm like, "You got to be kidding me on Blood Bowl." So, but
for the people that are listening, you want to explain what Blood Bowl is?
Blood Bowl is a it's a video game and stuff now, and it's Games Workshop's been publishing it for way too many years, 35 years, I guess, something like that. But Blood Bowl is essentially fantasy football, except for, it's not like sitting around a rotisserie. It's fantasy football in which the elves and dwarves and vampires and goblins and skeletons and dragons and tree men and whatever play football, American football, but not really American football, because it's what a British man in the 1980s considered American football to be like, right? When they were able to watch it once a week, one game on BBC at 3 a.m. So there wasn't a lot of exposure to the rules, didn't really understand it. So the Blood Bowl ends up being something like a cross between American football, rugby, and soccer.
Okay.
And it's just all over the place. One of the things they hired me to do when I was there was working the Blood Bowl Companion, which actually introduced rules that made it a little bit more like football. But it turned out the actual original rules were fantastic. So they ended up, the other editions of the game have just built on that. So
okay.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun, and the whole thing's like full of just really dumb jokes all the way through, right? Like the teams are like the Bad Bay Hackers and the Orkland Raiders, and they drink Killer Genuine Draft and Bloodweiser, and the big sponsors, and it's just crazy. It's fun, but it's so I wrote a trilogy of novels, and it starts out with a guy who's a dragon slayer, a wannabe dragon slayer, who screws it up entirely, gets almost the entire town killed, but manages to pick up a spear and down a dragon with it at about 50 yards. And this happens in front of a Blood Bowl scout, this little halfling, who says, "Oh, dear God, that's my next quarterback right there. That's my next thrower." And boom, you're off to the races, and you get to see it through his eyes. He's like, what the heck are you talking about? So I wrote a trilogy of novels for that. They hired me to write a fourth one. Then I wrote 5 issues of a comic book as well, and had a great time with it. And doing that right now, I'm working on Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus, which is a mobile game from Snowprint Studios, the guys who did this game called Riven Guard that
Okay.
came out. It's for iOS and Android. And right now they're doing a soft launch for the Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus in a number of countries. I think it's mostly in Asia and maybe Australia, I forget. But a lot of times what they do is they'll do, these companies do mobile games. They'll do these soft launches in smaller markets with the idea that we'll work out the bugs now. And, when we're not embarrassing ourselves in front of millions of people, just
Right.
thousands of people. And then we'll move on to the bigger markets when we feel more confident about it. So they've been having me write the story for the first 3 campaigns for this so far. I'm on the 3rd one right now. And those are basically Warhammer 40,000 campaigns, right? This little tactical war game that you get to play. It's a lot of fun, actually. I enjoyed. I don't work in the art or the gameplay or anything like that, but I enjoy playing with it. It's a ton of fun. But I get to string the missions together and try to make some story sense out of them. Which is
And that's some of that
kind of
is
where
what makes those games fun, is the stories. Like
I think so.
like these days, like the art is, it can be amazing art and a horrible game, but it could be a horrible art, but if the story is really good, I'll play it.
Well, I have this long-standing rant I do because I'm also on the International Game Developers Association Writers SIG, which is special interest group. I'm on the board for that, and for about 15, 20 years now, we've been advocating for having more story in games, right? Because originally the guys who wrote story for games were just the programmers who said, well, we got to string this stuff together somehow, right?
Right.
But to me, the thing about games and stories is once you have that original technology, whatever it happens to be, whether it's a match 3 game or first person shooter or whatever the heck it is that you're playing, or it doesn't matter. Eventually that's the most exciting thing in the world. You're just like, oh, this is great fun. I'm learning all this great stuff. I'm playing these new things, but eventually that gets boring, right? There's only so many permutations of that. So then you're like, well, how do I get people interested in this? And how do I set this up to make it more intriguing for them?
Right.
And the answer is generally story, right? And it can be just like, okay, now instead of, it's not just a chessboard, these chess pieces are actually getting up, and I'm gonna have a little bit of lore for each one of them. But then we're gonna do a campaign, and we're gonna tell you why this battle is important, why this matters, what happens. And then we build it up. So, you're starting out, you're this, young farm boy or girl running off into the woods and learning all this stuff. And then eventually you build up to where you're, conquering the universe. And, story is the kind of thing that allows you to do those things and to feel attached to them and to care about them. Right. And so I think that's true whether or not you're watching a film or reading a comic book or playing a game, or even if it's a tabletop game where you're making up the story with your friends around the table, or a video game where you're having it fed you more because you're not coming up with the story so much as you're playing through a story in a lot of cases.
Right.
Although sometimes you get spontaneous stories occur too, and it's just amazing as well. So,
do you play games yourself?
I play, yes. I play lots of games. I don't have an ongoing role playing campaign these days, and I haven't had for many years, probably since before my kids were born.
Okay.
But part of that's because as a game designer, I'm not your regular gamer, right? I'm not the guy who sits down and says, I'm going to sit down and buy this game for $100 and then play the hell out of it until I get bored of it, right? I'm the guy who sits down and says, well, I got this game. I'm going to play it once, figure out how it works, dissect it, vivisect it, and then I've got what I want out of it. So
right.
I'm moving on to the next thing. And it's not because I don't want to play the game forever. In fact, if we had a game that really hits well with the kids here and we can play together, we'll play it over and over. Wingspan is the biggest one in the house right now.
Yeah.
Everybody's like, when are we going to get the new expansion? Okay, we got the expansions. Let's play.
The video game version or the board game version?
We play the board game version, right? And we just love that. And the kids play all sorts of video games. I've worked in a lot of different video game companies, and one of the as a freelancer, one of the first things that happens always is they sit down and say, have you played this game? Our game is kind of like this crossed with this. And it's impossible to have played every video game, no matter how much we may try.
Yeah.
So my next stop after that first meeting is usually to GameStop or to Amazon to say, all right, I need this, this, and this, so I can figure out what the hell they're talking about. That means we end up with a lot of consoles of different ages in the house, and me playing lots of games, and then the kids get all that sloughed off to them. So they love it. Right?
I bet. Are you
So
working on? Are you playing something? Anything right now?
well, you mean it was video game or tabletop?
Video game?
I just finished Elden Ring.
Okay.
Right? Well, I beat Elden Ring. I was like, yes. So right now I'm going back through and like, well, I missed that little place there, and I missed this dungeon here. So I'm exploring a little bit more before I finally give up on it. Last year, my eldest son got me onto the Yakuza games
Okay.
from what's it called, Like a Dragon Studios, right? And so there's like 8 Yakuza games, and then 2 more that are their Judgment games, Lost Judgment,
Okay.
the Judgment and Lost Judgment. So I played every one of those. I got hooked good all the way through last year because all the Yakuza games were now suddenly free on Xbox Game Pass. I'm like,
Oh
well, I
wow.
should finally try that. And boom, I played them all. And then the Judgment games, which are by the same studio, were not free. But I'm like, here's my money, take it. I'm going to play these through. And I loved them. They're a lot of fun, right? Just a really good storytelling games. And my son, Marty, who's actually doing game design with me these days and writing
Nice.
as well, he was like, Dad, this is your thing. You're going to love this. So the next thing I'm going to probably tackle, which I've not played yet, is Disco Elysium. And I've been dying to play it, but I've been like, well, I don't actually have a PC in the house because the kids keep wandering off with the PCs when they go off to college. So I'm like, okay, and then it's on Xbox, but I just placed an order but we ordered it on Steam, and I've got a Steam Deck on order right now. And I'm like, my eldest son, his Steam Deck came in, so I'm like, oh, mine should be here. I can, yep. So I'm kind of hoping to wait till that shows up. But who knows? I might crack and finally buy the Xbox version instead and just play that.
When you play these games, does it make it easier when when you go in and you get somebody says, "Hey, can you do a Halo novel for us?"
Oh yeah,
For those tie-in fictions, like, is that like, well, I already know this game, or is that one of those ones where you go and get the game and then you write the tie-in book?
it depends. Nowadays, it's mostly stuff where I'm already familiar with it, right? Because otherwise, I'll usually turn down an offer. Somebody else offer me something. I'll say, well, I'm not familiar with that, and maybe you should hire this person over here who really loves it, right? But on other times, it's like, well, no, yeah, I love that. Like, for instance, when the Halo novels came my way, I had written a novel for Pocket Books for Ed Schlesinger over there, was my editor, and based on Guild Wars, right, which was an MMO. And they hired me to do a novel that was going to bridge the gap between Guild Wars 1 and Guild Wars 2.
Right.
And I had not played any of that stuff at the time, but I knew people Jeff Grubb from TSR back in the day, who I had known, was one of the designers on, one of the lore people for Guild Wars. And so they had a bunch of us pitch ideas, and I'm like, how do you tell an exciting adventure story that spans 250 years and gives you all this background and all these different things? And I'm like, oh. So I swiped from the best. I basically stole from the Canterbury Tales. So it's an adventure story that goes, but it's a road movie, right? So you're going from one spot to the next.
Okay.
Every time you stop at camp, one of the characters stops and says, let me tell you a story here, right? And the neat thing about that is it allows them to frame the things that have either just happened or just about to happen to give them context so you care about them.
Right.
And coincidentally also allows us to do a lore dump essentially and say, and you guys who don't understand about this stuff, this is what this is really about. So so that worked out pretty well. But the problem was the game was still in development. So that meant it wasn't just shooting at a moving target, it was shooting at an exploding target because there's a lot of different targets. And I ended up at the end of the day, we ended up hiring Jeff Grubb to be my co-author on it, because he was, even as the guy writing the lore in the studio, was behind and could not keep up. And there's no way in hell I was going to be able to pull it off. So Jeff came in and did a draft. And I did a final polish over that just to make it sound more like me, in my style. But it came out pretty well. And then when Pocket Books got the Halo license, I think it came over to them from Tor. And I actually saw an announcement about it. So I was writing I wrote Ed Schlesinger. I said, God, Ed, you better hire me to write these. And Ed writes me back, says, Dear Matt, I was just writing you a letter right now, an email, to ask you if you were interested. I said, well, the answer is yes, because Halo is the game where I taught all my kids how to play first-person shooters on Halo.
Oh, wow.
I've been playing it since the Xbox came out. And in fact, I was interviewing with Bungie for a freelance gig 3 years before Halo came out. And I was down in Chicago back when their offices were there. I was for some fantasy game. John Scott Tynes actually got the deal. And John is now one of the guys who's heading up D&D over at Wizards of the Coast. So
oh, nice.
He's doing okay. Good guy too. I've done stuff with him over the years. Great human being. And while I was at the Bungie studios, they actually said, hey, let me take you over and show you this. And it's like, ooh, this is the Halo demo, right? They're just, before it even been announced. And they're like, look, that's the Warthog. You can actually see different color dirt comes off the tires depending on what it's running on. Like, And this is back in the day when Unreal Engine, like Unreal 1 was the biggest damn thing in the
Yeah.
world. I'm like, yeah, I was in love with Halo from early days. So when the chance came to write Halo novels, I'm like, yes, sign me up. So no trouble there at all. I ended up writing 3 of those, and it was a blast working with those guys. So, and I've known a lot of guys at Microsoft over the years. Turns out, a game I worked on 20 some years ago that was being run by Microsoft at the time just won a Peabody Award, right?
Oh, wow.
The Peabodys, which are for media, they finally decided to start acknowledging interactive stuff, right?
That's good.
So for the first time, and it takes people a while to catch up, I understand.
Yeah.
But they decided to give out legacy awards because of that, saying, okay, see, these are some of the most amazing things over the last 20 some years that we've missed. And one of those was for a game called The Beast, which was the world's first big alternate reality game. And it was a promotional game that we developed for AI, which was the Steven Spielberg film that he took over from Stanley Kubrick, right?
Okay.
And this came out many, many years ago. But what we did is, if you watch the trailer for AI, at the bottom of it, if you freeze framed it, which was a hard thing to do back in those days because you had to sit there with your mouse and try to pause things, it said Janine Sala, sentient machine therapist. And you're like, well, what the hell is that? So on an early version of Google or Yahoo or Ask Jeeves or whatever was going back in those days, that would lead you down a rabbit hole of websites that we had developed from, I think it was 100 years in the future, right? And it wasn't just the one thing. So you got in this thing, it was actually a murder mystery. But then the murder mystery was connected to all sorts of other different things. I was developing like websites that had standings for giant robot battles, for mech fighting and all this kind of stuff, for mech fighting leagues. And they were, having to develop all the background for that,
Right.
including like Japanese cell phone games that were about tea ceremonies and things, right? It was just really, really involved. And the guys heading it up were Jordan Weissman, who was at founded FAST and then was at Microsoft at the time because he had sold FAST Interactive to them. Pete Fenlon, who was with
Right.
Iron Crown and then was with Catan later, is now with Asmodee. Elon Lee, who founded Exploding Kittens, and Sean Stewart, who's a fantastic writer as well, and has done a ton of great novels and such as well. So I got to work with those guys and a guy named Alex Irvine, who's another writer who does a lot of this kind of stuff, and a bunch of other people I'm probably never know their names because there were dozens of us working.
Right.
But that one at Peabody, I'm like, that's so freaking cool. Pete actually called me up the morning it was going to be announced and said, Matt, I have something to tell you. I'm like, oh, good. This is going to be good. So, and Pete's just one of my great friends in the industry. I mean, we've done vacations together and, wandered around Key West, slept on a boat in Key West and done whitewater rafting, and just fantastic guy, one of my best friends.
Awesome. What do you think of the new Halo movie that's been announced? Are you excited for that?
I'm excited about that. I mean, I haven't watched the whole Halo TV show, right? The TV show is like 4 or 5 episodes in. I've only managed to watch the first 2 episodes, but I think the guy that they got playing the Master Chief is actually pretty damn good, right? He pulls it off. I mean, the Halo TV show is different than the Halo lore that comes from the books and the novels, but that's part of what you do, right?
Right.
It's just, not everything wants to match up. And for one, you want to lean into the strengths of the medium that you're working in. Doing something that would all be from a first person point of view as you're running around shooting aliens as a TV show would be nauseating for one. Right?
Yeah, like Doom, right?
Exactly,
with The Rock.
Right? Yeah, we saw how that worked, right? But you never know. I mean, somebody else is going to come up with a way to actually pull that off. And it's going to be fantastic, right? There actually were a couple scenes where they did first person stuff in the TV show, but fortunately they did not stick with that the entire time. So
the Sam Raimi Evil Dead cam where it's
exactly
like that did well, I guess.
Well, Sam is doing all right for himself. I just saw the Doctor Strange movie this weekend with my kids.
I haven't seen it yet. I need to. I need to see it.
If
for no other reason, to see the Bruce Campbell.
Bruce Campbell's in it, right? He's in everything Sam does, and those are Michigan boys, right? So I never met them when we were out there, but I went to school in Ann Arbor, and it was a bit younger than they were. But man, when I was reading their biographies, I'm like, man, this is just all the stuff I know from back then. It's just too much fun. See these Detroit boys do some good. But when you're watching Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, there are some moments where you're like, yeah, only Sam Raimi could do that, right? And it's just him all the way. So
right, and I'm very excited for it, and it's nice to see him back in the fold with Marvel
Yeah,
stuff.
exactly. Having done 3 Spider-Man movies, which were in the day, the 3 best superhero movies ever made.
Yeah, it's kind of,
You know,
it's almost
to
like the
that
start
time.
of it, really.
Yep.
I
Amazing.
know a lot of people credit Iron Man, but really,
Well, if they hadn't had those Spider-Man movies, they wouldn't have had the money. Nobody would have trusted Marvel to actually go off and make the Iron Man movies. So in
right.
that sense, absolutely correct, right? And of course, doing the Spider-Man movies is one of the things that helped bring Marvel out of bankruptcy in the 90s, because that's when they started selling off movie rights to a lot of different things.
Hmm.
That's why Spider-Man still was Sony, and that's why the X-Men were with Fox until Disney bought them, and now they own that as well, and
Yeah.
the Fantastic Four, etc. So
How did you
uh,
get into Marvel? Were you always a big Marvel fan?
I was huge into Marvel, man. I started learning how to read on Marvel comics, really. My dad was a comic book fan when he was a kid, although his mom threw out all of them when he went to college. So, I don't have that stack of golden age stuff, but um, I learned one of the comics I remember reading early on was Spidey comics, which were developed for kids, like 6 and up. And I started reading them when I was like 3, and they were teamed up with the Electric Company, which was the show that came on after Sesame Street,
Okay.
if you're of that era, right? From the 70s growing up. And this guy named Easy Reader with this goofy hat and sunglasses, reading a book, said, "Hey kids, reading is cool," right? And then Spider-Man actually would make appearances in costume on the Electric Company as a live action TV
Oh
show
wow.
and wander around. And he was really goofy looking. He had this funny costume that all was licensed from Marvel. The funny part is you find out years later that Easy Reader was actually played by Morgan Freeman, right? Who's now the voice of God and one of the
Yeah.
most renowned and venerated actors of our time. So,
Yeah.
but he started out playing Easy Reader on Sesame
I
Street
didn't know
or
that.
on the Electric Company. Sounds like good stuff. But yeah, I started reading Marvel comics, and basically my brother and I teamed up. We would take our allowance and go buy comics every week, and he would buy X-Men, and I would buy Spider-Man or Batman or whatever, and then we'd swap comics, and we just keep reading them that way until we. And even when I went off to college, he kind of stopped doing it then, but I kept reading them through college and beyond. I've worked on a number of different Marvel games over the years too, and actually DC stuff too. So it's been good fun.
How is that to go, hey, this is something I grew up on, and now you're producing content for them?
It's a real kick, right? To be able to say, I get to put words in Spider-Man's mouth or Wolverine's mouth or whatever. It's neat. But on the other hand, you also feel the pressure because you're like, oh man, I don't want to, this is something that matters to me personally.
Yeah.
I also know there are a lot of fans out there. So if I screw this up, I'm going to hear from it. So, and rightfully so. I'm not going to argue with that. But it's tricky, like some of the stuff I've done. I did a Marvel Heroes Battle Dice game for Playmates Toys that came out like, geez, almost 20 years ago now. I guess
Wow.
maybe 18 years ago. And that actually had television commercials, and it was in Walmart and Toys R Us and Target and all that stuff. And I've worked on a couple different Marvel MMOs, just doing barks and dialogue bits. Barks are the bits in video game where the character says something at random, right? It's not part of a cutscene or a cinematic or anything. It's just like those the dialogues when they're tapping their foot saying, "Okay, come on, moving on," or
Yeah.
"Hey, I've been shot," or "Ouch, I need help over here," that kind of stuff. When you write a bark, you have to usually write like 10, maybe 20 variations on it, right?
Oh,
Because
okay.
then they have the voice actor go in and do like 3 takes at each one of those, and then they can randomly pull those so it doesn't sound like the same thing every time, because it would drive you nuts,
Yeah.
right? Or the same voice doing the same thing, it gets boring pretty quickly. But if you can hear 10 different variations done 3 different ways, that doesn't become boring as quickly, and hopefully you don't hear it as often. So,
Yeah.
but I tell you, if you've been writing these things, writing the first 20 is okay, maybe 30, but once you start getting beyond that, you're like, oh man, how do I say help, I'm hurt? in a new way that evokes character and is fun and is different.
And that character would say that way.
Yeah,
too,
exactly, right? And you're like, this is a challenge. So, but you do it because that's the job, but it's fun. So
Right.
no complaints.
So you did the Marvel Encyclopedia too, right?
I did 2 editions of the Marvel Encyclopedia, and a Captain America book, and an Avengers Encyclopedia, and actually a kids book, all for DK Publishing, which was a licensee of Marvel. That was funny because I just happened to be at Comic-Con one year. I think I was pushing the Eberron novels I wrote for TSR for Wizards of the Coast for Dungeons and Dragons, right? For their Eberron setting.
Yeah.
And I've written a trilogy of those, and they had me out signing some stuff. I actually got to sign right after Carrie Fisher one day. She was signing Star Wars stuff for the Star Wars collectible card game, and I'm like, and she's like, "I'll be right out of your way." I'm like, "Oh my God, stay here as long as you like." And so after that, I'm wandering around. I got nothing to do, so I'm just going to all the different booths, and I dropped a business card with an editor. I says, "Are any editors here at DK? You got a Marvel license? I love Marvel stuff. I write all this stuff. You should hire me." And like 3 months later, I got an email from Alistair Dougal over there saying, "Would you be interested in revising the Marvel Encyclopedia for us?" So, yes, sir, I would. So,
Was that difficult to like accumulate all the information for that?
well, the funny part is they revise every 5 years. And so I had to go back and make sure I knew everything for 5 years. And I also had to go back and make sure everything else was accurate too, right? The first part of the job is going through the book and saying, is this all accurate still? Because a lot of times it gets retconned or things have been changed or they've been re-explained or whatever. And then you have to see which characters need to be changed. So the first part of the job is trying to say, okay, what's the scope of this job? And the second part of the job is now I have to do this, right? I've defined the scope of the job, and now I've made my bed and I must lie in it. And it's good fun though. But yeah, I tell you, after working on one of those books and stuffing all that stuff in my head, I usually stop reading comic books for about a year. Right?
Okay. Yeah.
Because I'm like, all right, I've got it all now. I need to go outside, touch grass. I need to, find play some video games, see my kids, my wife, whatever. Get away from graphic stuff for just a while, right?
And then sadly you find out that the only video game you have is a Marvel. It's like, no.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm like, oh, cool. Yeah, I tell you, one of the things I got hooked on was Marvel Puzzle Quest, right? Which my friend Alex Irvine writes the story for. He was one of the guys on the Beast with us way back.
Okay.
And I don't know what part of it's because I ended up having these health issues where I had to put I had glaucoma, I had to put eye drops in my eyes, and you have to wait like 5 minutes in between them. You're like, okay, I got to sit here. I can't really do anything else. I got 5 minutes. Oh, I could do a match 3 Marvel game. Fantastic, right? So now I've been playing for like 7 years, I think, or whatever it is.
Wow.
And the funny part is there are a lot of guys in the gaming industry that we're all friends on Facebook, whatever, and it links through that. So like, hey, we'll send people things, and it just does it randomly. And you're like, okay, why not? But I just keep up with it just like on a daily basis. Now it's Wordle is the other thing. Everybody plays Wordle. My entire family is playing Wordle.
I'm intentionally keeping away from Wordle just because I know me, and I know I'd be like, all right, I got to get this every day, and my day would be wasted.
The genius thing about Wordle, though, is it's a 1 a day thing.
Yeah.
Right. So your commitment is low. On the other hand, my wife figured out that there were people who had archives of this stuff up. She has gone now back and done every Wordle ever made. And I'm like, yeah, she just got hooked good. Oh, no, honey, that's okay, whatever. Have your fun. It's good. And yeah, she's not much of a gamer. She's not a video gamer. She'll play the occasional tabletop game with us, but it's not her thing, right? But man, Wordle has got her hooked hard. So.
Did you play any of the because you do board games as well? Did you play any of like the Marvel card game?
Actually, what was it? Marvel Legendary. Devin Lowe introduced himself to me at Gen Con when it was just in this playtest form. It hadn't actually been released yet, and said, okay, hey, I'd like to show this to you and your son, Marty, who was like 12 at the time. I'd like to show this to you and get your opinion. So we actually got to playtest it before it even came out. It was a blast, right? In fact, one of the first collectible card games I worked on was Wildstorms, which was the collectible card game produced by Wildstorm, which was Jim Lee's division of Image Comics way back in the day. Now Jim is the creative director of DC Comics. He's in charge of Batman, Wonder Woman, everything else, right? But back in the day, he had his own studio, part of Image Comics that he had developed. And a friend of mine who had been working at Capital City Comics had recommended me for this gig. He and a guy named Drew Bittner, who was one of his editors, had come up with a collectible card game. But they knew it wasn't tight, right? Yeah. So they're like, okay, let's get in somebody who's done this professionally and bring him in. So they brought me in. They flew me out to La Jolla, which is just north of San Diego, and said, what do you think? I said, no. I mean, it wasn't terrible. It was overly complicated. I'm like, what you need to do is prune this down to the fun parts, right? And then that's going to leave you with this, and then we'll have to figure out how we can make it even more fun from there. And so they actually hired me in to do that with them. So I got to sit down and co-design a game with Drew and Jim, and it was a blast. And it made John Neame many years later told me it actually saved the company because it brought them a lot of money at a time when the company was running a little shy of cash. And,
Yeah.
then they turned around a few years later and sold it to DC Comics and, made themselves quite a bit of cash that way too. John was actually the producer. He actually became, he worked for DC for many years, and then became the publisher of Marvel Comics, and was actually the guy who hired me to write the Marvel role-playing game. Believe it or not.
Okay.
Right? Like
Full circle.
30 years later, or maybe 27 years later, or whatever it was. So
Yeah.
yeah, so it's kind of funny that way that it's like anything else in the world. Once you start getting into a field, your reputation follows you. You do good things, hopefully. And if you manage to persevere long enough and don't wash out for one reason or another, often it's because you got expenses, you got sickness, whatever. You decide that you can't live the pauper's life of a game designer anymore. You move on to other things. But if you stick around, then those things come back to you, and then you can actually, I've made a decent living doing this for God since 1989 now. So ever since I got out of college in '89.
And you get to do stuff that makes you happy.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, I could have made more money as a banker. My father's an attorney. I could have made more money doing that. But when I was in college, I was, I was about 19 years old at the time. When I was in college, I had gotten a permission to do a dual degree program. My parents were like, I want to be a writer. I said, and they're like, great. I'm going to go get an English degree. I'm going to get a creative writing degree. Great. But that's not enough. You need to get something that will actually pay bills. So I was good at math and science as well. So they said, well, which is why I'm a game designer too. I get both halves.
Right.
And they're like, well, why don't you go into electrical engineering, computer science as well? Right. Which was one major back in the day at Michigan. And so I actually had a dual degree program where I was going to get a BA in creative writing and a BS in electrical engineering, computer science at the same time and get out in 5 years. And after about 2 years of doing this, I realized that this was going to make me a very miserable man in my 40s, right? Because what was going to happen is I was going to graduate, I was going to get that electrical engineering job so I could pay the bills and then write in the evenings is what I would tell myself. But I also knew that I wasn't that disciplined. I was going to want to go have a beer with my buddies, play some games, see my girlfriend, all this kind of stuff. And the chances of me actually getting around to writing that novel or designing that game were going to fall dramatically depending on how good that job was to me, right? And assuming I was good at the job and I actually liked it, I was maybe never going to do that. And somewhere in my 40s, I was going to look back and say, God, I could have done that instead. Yeah. So my dad says it was my quarter life crisis, right? So I called my parents up and said, I'm going to drop out of school and I'm going to, and they're like, no, just finish out the term. And then you can, I actually ended up finishing the term and finishing my creative writing degree in a total of 3 years, got out of college in 3 years.
Wow.
And then went full-time into creating stuff and told myself if I ever screwed it up entirely, I'd just go back and finish off the electrical engineering degree.
Yeah.
In 2 years. Of course, at this point, it's way too late. I made myself useless to anything else. I don't remember. I was taking Calc 4 with fourth order differential linear equations and such. And I used
so
to
it wouldn't be like fresh in your mind.
Right, exactly. There's no way. I mean, I was fluent in Spanish too, and I don't remember a lot of that anymore either. So over the years, the things that you don't do atrophy, right? So
yeah.
But yeah, I got into doing games instead because I just love doing games. And I fell in with the wrong crowd, essentially. The guys who, Troy Denning was the guy who introduced me to Will and got me into doing this stuff, and Will Niebling. And then Marty Stever was one of my friends at Michigan, ended up going on to Capital City Comics and then running Whiz Kids as I think he was the vice president of Whiz Kids for a while. And then has done all sorts of different stuff over the years. And, if I hadn't fallen in with the wrong crowd, I don't know, I might have done something else entirely, but, they were the right people at the right time. I got lucky. A lot of people will tell you that it's just hard work, but man, luck means a lot. There's a lot of people out there just as talented as I am who didn't manage to stick with it or whatever, just because they weren't in the right place at the right time. And you just don't have any control over that. The trick, of course, is having enough perseverance that you may not be able to be there at the right time. If you can figure out where the right place is and stick around there long enough, hopefully you'll be there when the right time comes along. Right?
Well, I think that's great advice. You mentioned a little bit ago, we talked about just briefly, you mentioned the Marvel RPG, and we spun around to that. And we've been told we can talk about it.
Amazingly, I know. Actually, I think this is the first non-Marvel interview where they said, "Yeah, it's okay to talk about the places." Now, of course, I'm not allowed to talk about anything that's in the works,
still in the
works.
Yeah, so we can talk about the playtest.
We can. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about the game and how you got brought in to doing the playtest.
I got a copy right here.
All right.
There you go. So this
And it's a gorgeous
is,
cover, by the way.
thank you. Yeah, it's Ivan Coelho, I think it's Coelho.
And people listening to the podcast, go on wherever you, Amazon, Matt Forbeck's website, you can look it up.
There you go. It's fantastic stuff. But what they did is they hired in a guy named Mike Capsamy, John hired us, and Mike was actually the president or fairly high up at Epic Games, right? Which is the guys who developed Fortnite and Gears of War. And he was one of the original writers for a lot of that stuff. So the guy's he also has a doctorate in mathematics and went to MIT for undergrad. I mean, the guy knows his stuff, right? And then they brought me in to help out as well. So Mike unfortunately ended up having to leave the project, but he did a lot of the basic stuff, the math behind it. And I came in, tinkered with stuff as well. We did a lot of co-design at the beginning. Part of the idea was to come out with a 32 or 48 page booklet that would give people the idea behind the game, and then as a play test, right? And then we would see how well it went, see if people responded well to it, and then we do a full-on game a year later. But the problem is, it turns out that a 48 page book is not a lot of room for a game book. So this actually ended up being 120 pages, which still looks pretty thin compared to, like, say, let's see.
Yeah.
Like, this is a role-playing game I produced based on my fantasy novels, right? For Cypher System, Money Cook Games does.
Yeah.
And that's a full-on role-playing game. It's 300 and some pages.
Yeah.
That's a 120 page playtest book. So the actual Marvel game, when it comes out, the full-on Marvel game, what we call the core rule book, will be somewhere in the 300 to 400 page range, and hardcover, 8.5 by 11, all that kind of stuff. Look like a regular D&D style role-playing game, right?
Yeah.
But meanwhile, we have this really snazzy looking softcover book, which is only $10, right? I mean, it's a pretty good deal. Some people don't like to pay for playtesting, which I totally understand and respect. Don't. Wait for the real game to come out, right? But if you're interested in this kind of stuff, or you're excited about it, and you want to help us out, we'd appreciate it. So,
well, and for $10, I mean, if they gave you out that book and said, $50, that'd be one thing. But $10 is,
it's not a lot of money. And again, if you don't want to pay it, don't. Right?
It's like getting a graphic novel for $14. It's about the same size.
Exactly. This is actually, for what it is, it's mostly paying for the printing, right?
Right.
And then we also have it on Roll20 and Demiplane. We announced like 2 weeks before it all came out that they're our digital partners, and they're doing some great stuff with it too. So part of the development of it was, we're coming up with all these powers, and they have power sets and archetypes and all this kind of stuff. And we're like, which characters are we going to have in the game? And they're like, well, and then they showed me this cover that they had come up with. And I'm like, well, those are all the characters we're going to fit in. If we can fit in more, then we will. And it turned out, no, we couldn't fit in anymore. So we put these guys in the game. And actually, that meant that we cut some of the power sets that weren't going to be for those characters, right? Like, we had developed the Invisible Woman entirely, and I'm like, well, that's great, but none of these characters use invisibility powers. So since we're running shy on space, let's not put that in there, right?
Right.
Well, because what we're really trying to test here is the combat system and the character design system, and see how all that stuff works. Then we're going to try to do some extra playtest rounds as we go further on too, right? Like kind of like Wizards of the Coast does with their Unearthed Arcana stuff, where they say, hey, we want you to test this out for a few weeks and let us know what you think.
Yeah.
And we're trying to get that ramped up. Marvel's been great to work with, but they are not a gaming company. They're a comic book company, right?
Right.
So again, one of the reasons that we want to do a 120 page, and this was originally supposed to be 108 pages, even we bumped it up from there, but 102 pages, whatever that was. Yeah. The reason we came up with a 120 page book like this is because Marvel knows how to print these, right? This is really easy for them to do. This is something they've been doing for decades. When it comes out to printing a hardcover 8.5 by 11 full color 300 some page book, that's not a Marvel thing. That's something they usually license out to other people, right?
Yeah.
And this is unusual in that this is not a game that's being licensed to anybody else. It's actually being published by Marvel directly.
Right.
And
I have to laugh. Somebody, I normally don't do this. I normally don't mention the live stream chat, but somebody made a very good point. I mean, if their power is invisibility, how could you tell they weren't on the cover?
That's true. Good point. See, this is why the playtest happens. If I'd only thought of that. That's great. Now my brain's blowing. I need to rethink everything. So
normally I don't mention the live stream chat. But
how could you not?
Right? Like we
That's
would
too
have gotten it to the Q&A after the podcast is over, but I gotta call that one
in
right off
all
the
of
bat.
my non-existent Marvel power, you get a Marvel no prize for that, which is also not a prize. So there you go.
Okay.
That was pretty good. But yeah, so we came up with this. We put it out there. We're developing the game as we go, and all sorts of other powers and such too. Honestly, at the moment, I'm just getting through playtest feedback, trying to get all that stuff in, and I'm not doing too much development on the game as far as coming up with new powers and characters, because I want to see how we change things, so I don't have to redo everything over and over and over and over again, right?
Mhm.
Game design tends to be iterative, in that you come up with an idea, you show it to people, they say, I love this part, that part sucks. And you keep doing this until they say, I love all these parts, and maybe this little part here I don't like so much, right?
Right.
Can't make everybody happy about everything, but you want to try to make it a decent game that as many people like as possible. So doing a public playtest like this, I often of the opinion that it's impossible to properly playtest a role-playing game, right?
Yeah.
Because there's just too many permutations, too much context that goes into things. But if you have any shot in doing it at all, the way to do it is to put it out there and have thousands of people play it,
Right.
right?
Right.
And get their feedback in a format that we can all collate and put together, and then take a look at and say, okay, yeah, we boned this up entirely. We should have figured that out early. This part here, maybe everybody seems to like, so we're going to keep this. And that's one of the things I ask people when they're doing feedback too, is don't tell us just how we screwed things up. All right, that's the easy way. I mean, tell us that, because we need to know, right? But tell us the stuff that you love too, because
Right.
the tendency for any creative, whether it's, you're reading somebody, your friend's novel as they're working on it, or play testing their card game or whatever, the tendency, if somebody doesn't tell you what's good about it, is to throw that stuff out with the bad stuff,
Yeah.
right? Literally the baby with the bathwater. Well, not literally, it's metaphoric. I mean, you don't want to throw out the good stuff with the bad stuff. You want to have people say, this stuff I adored, this stuff sucks. That's fine. Be passionate about it if you want to. You can also be polite. That's okay. We don't mind polite.
How does the system as it stands now as the playtest, how does it compare to some of the other more well-known RPGs, whether it be like
Sure.
a D&D or a Pathfinder or a Mutants and Masterminds or a Savage Worlds? How does it compare as far as the system
It's
goes?
about that complexity level, right? And I know we went back and forth on this. I mean, it's maybe a little bit lighter than D&D, especially because D&D's got decades, and even since 5th edition came out, is had a lot of books put out for, right? So it's a little bit lighter than D&D in that sense, but it's we had a lot of early discussions about, should we go like doing narrative stuff? Should we do like powered by the apocalypse type stuff? Should we do just battle simulations, like a miniatures game essentially, right? And we didn't want to make it too hard on people. We didn't want to make it too hard. What we really want to be able to say is, if you're playing Dungeons and Dragons or Shadow or any very popular game, these like D&D or Pathfinder or Savage Worlds or any of these games, this will not be like, oh my God, you've never seen anything like this before. This will be something you say, I get this immediately. I know
Okay.
what I'm doing. This is familiar to me. Now we're going to throw some curveballs at you in the way that we do things. And obviously the power is going to be different, all that kind of stuff. And obviously it's in the Marvel universe, so we get to have a lot of fun with that kind of stuff. But you do not have to learn everything from scratch, or say, part of the problem with getting people to even pick up a role-playing game is a lot of people look at it and say, what the hell are you talking about?
Right.
So we don't want to alienate people that way. We want people who already like this kind of stuff to say, I understand this, and then we'll play with you from there, right? So this is not going to be a groundbreaking mechanics in the way that you're like. I love those kind of games, right? Like Fiasco is one of my favorite games that Jason Morningstar put out, and it's just an amazing, stunning example of how to reinvent role-playing games, right? That's not what we're trying to do here. We're not trying to reinvent role-playing games. We're trying to put out the best role-playing game we can for Marvel, right? Best Marvel role-playing game. So set your expectations at that. That's what I want to aim for, right?
Okay. Is there something that you can really be proud of when you're looking at this from your perspective, to be like, this playtest is out there and I can't wait for you guys to see this, and this, or this character, or how this build works, or character creation, or anything like that?
Well, because it's not done, I'm not terribly proud of any of it.
Okay. Yeah, you can say that.
Yeah, because it's not finished, right? And
right.
Honestly, as a game designer and as a creator, I'm often not really proud of my things until they're just about done, and then I hate them. Right? And it's not because they're terrible. It's just at that point I don't want to see them anymore. I'm like, yeah, this is done. Don't show it to me again. It's good. Put it out there in the world. And then of course you have to go through editing and you have to proofread it and all this kind of stuff. And by the time you're done with it, you're like, oh, I just don't want to see it again. And then you go out to conventions and you get jazzed again because people are like, oh, let's play the game. You're like, yes. And you're like, oh, this is actually fun. I did something cool, you know?
Yeah.
But I haven't got to the point where I hate the game yet, which means I know it's not done, right?
Okay.
But when I do get to that point, I'll be like, okay, I've done as much with this as I possibly can. I'm going to have other people. We're going to have proofreaders and editors and all this kind of stuff, but we're not at that point yet. That said, I think there's some neat stuff in the game. I mean, to answer your question originally, I think that the D616 system that we got going with the rolling of the dice, being able to manipulate the dice with edges and troubles, that's kind of a neat concept,
Okay.
right? To be able so for instance, the way the game works is that you have instead of rolling a D20 or a D100 or whatever, or playing cards, whatever, you roll 3 6-sided dice, which are like these, right? These are what I use in my playtest games. And one of them is an off-color die, right? And that's because you have to distinguish that as your Marvel die.
Okay.
On the Marvel die, if you roll a 1, that becomes a fantastic result, right? Like Fantastic Four or whatever.
Yeah.
And that means that something special happens. That means you can trigger off a special power or a special ability from your power, or it can give you double damage, or it can do all sorts of different things, right? And it also counts as a 6. So that means that the best roll you can get is a 6 on each of the other dice and a 1 for your Marvel die, or a 616, which is an inside Marvel joke to all the people who understand, and probably those who saw Doctor Strange this weekend. They talk about how the main Marvel Earth is 616.
Oh, okay.
Right? So, and that was a joke that Marvel came up with. I forget, maybe it's Alan Moore. It was a long time ago, but the idea was that DC always had like, what's the most important Earth? It's Earth 1. And the older Golden Age stuff, that's Earth 2. And then we have Earth 3 over here, right? And the Marvel guys like, no, we're just one of a bunch of different multiverses. In fact, this one is 616, right? So it's more like an area code than an actual, sequence of numbers.
But that works great when you're using 3 6-sided dice.
Exactly, right? And the neat thing about it is that we also have this thing called edges of trouble. So it's kind of like adds and advantages and disadvantages of Dungeons and Dragons. So if you do something, or if you have a power or whatever that gets you an advantage or an edge, then you get to re-roll one of your dice, right? If you have trouble, like things are going badly for you, the game master or the narrator, as we call them, can re-roll one of your dice instead, right?
Okay.
And he's got to balance out. So if you got 3 things going really well for you and 2 going bad, you get to roll 1.
Okay.
Edge, right? And that means you can manipulate those dice. If you can manage to role play things and get yourself in a good position where the context says everything's going right for you. Well, probably it'll go wrong later, but everything's going right for you now. That means you get to re-roll those dice and try to help yourself trigger off those special effects in your powers. And that's kind of a neat way to play the game, and also to figure out how to get those extra effects from your powers to come out. So pretty happy with that.
Do you have problems when you're like, okay, we've got these characters and you're building them and you have to deal with, how powerful they are in comparison to each other, and then somebody's like, well, no, that can't be this, and that has to be changed because this guy's technically more powerful than them, and then you're gonna have fans who come back and show examples. Do you have to deal with a lot of that stuff, and a lot of like the going to Marvel and being like, hey, this needs to be fixed, or they're like, nope, change this?
Yeah, yeah, we're already going through that. In fact, we're probably going to announce some stuff for some revisions coming out next week or two. But the idea is that I want people to be able to create any character they want to with the rules as they stand, right? The problem is, the funny part really is that a lot of the characters people create are going to be stronger and better role-playing game characters than the traditional Marvel characters. Okay. And that's because they're optimizing for the rule set. Whereas the writers from Marvel are not optimizing for the rule set. They're optimizing for story. We're going to be able to recreate those characters in the story, but you might look at that and say, that's a suboptimal build. And you'd be absolutely correct, right? Because again, we're trying to model that stuff. We're coming up with a way to model it, but there are going to be corners of the game then that you can expand into in ways that Spider-Man never would, right? But your spider dude or spider whatever you're playing would be happy to, right? You're going to be able to find exploits that are not narratively correct, but game correct, right? And that's actually something I try to talk about in the playtest rulebook. I'm in a section on the core rulebook where, it's about the spirit of the game. It's what you're trying to create here. If it's really all about min-maxing for you, go for it. Have fun. I mean, what you do at your own table is your own business. I don't care, right? But to me, when you're coming up with a game, you're playing a game, you should be trying to play in the spirit of the game, right? to give you an example, when we started playing D&D with my eldest son, there were he and his friends were like, "How do we make Molotov cocktails and gunpowder?" I'm like, well, sure, technically you could do that, but that's not really what the game's about, right? It's about killing people with swords and spells and whatever, defending the realm and whatever. It's not about how can I engineer a Gatling gun out of this, right?
Right.
And you can certainly play that game. In fact, the Shotguns and Sorcery game I got here, I got the T-shirt for,
Yeah.
is about including that kind of stuff in a fantasy setting and what that does to warp it. But if you're playing straight vanilla D&D, that's not where you should be going, right? And similarly, you can do all sorts of wacky stuff with Marvel. I mean, obviously, Marvel is not just X-Men stories, not just Fantastic Four, not just Spider-Man or Avengers. They tell so many different stories over the past 80 some years, 85 years now. That we need to be able to encompass all that. But if you're trying to tell a superhero story like that, there are certain things that are that are more Marvel than other settings, and maybe we try to encourage you to lean into that, and we try to make the rules help you with that. But if they don't always do that, we want you guys as players to also to reinforce that essentially. So we try to give people a little bit of coaching on that too. I mean, there's ways to break a game, but role-playing games shouldn't be about breaking a game, right? It shouldn't be about, it's not like Magic the Gathering or whatever. You're like, I'm trying to find the biggest exploit where I can just figure out how to, defeat my opponent. Because it's not about defeating an opponent, right? It's about creating a story together with your friends and having fun.
Especially when you're superheroes.
Exactly. It might be about defeating Hydra. Sure. Okay, that's fine.
Right.
But somebody's going to play a game where they're all Hydra characters or they're all Skrulls or whatever. And
right.
More power to you. Again,
a lot of people like playing as bad guys. That's just a little side thing that usually goes wrong. Are you going to be at any events? Yes. You mentioned off stream that you're going to be at Gen Con.
I never missed Gen Con. Last year was like my 40th Gen Con in a row, I believe. I've been going since I was a little kid. Well, not that little. I was 13, whatever. I'm an old man now. I'm going to be at Kubla Con out in San Francisco on Memorial Day weekend. I'm a special guest there, which I'm really excited about. Okay. Hang out with some good friends there. I'm going to be at Nexus Game Fair, which is in Milwaukee, the weekend of June 23rd through 26th. I am hopefully going to be at Comic-Con, although Marvel's still debating about what their official presence there is going to be like, but I should be out there at some point anyway. That's in the last part of July 21st through 24th. And I'll be at Gen Con for sure, which I never miss. I'm part of the writers track there. They do something called the Writers Symposium. So I go out there and I do panels on novels and things like that. And I also do some game design stuff. Looking to run a charity event for Munchkin, where we're going to play a game in honor of my friend Andrew Hackard, who was the Munchkin czar, who passed away last year. We're also going to be at, I might be at Worldcon in Chicago, because why the heck not? It's in Chicago. It's just down the street from me.
Yeah.
Might be in New York City Comic-Con, because again, that's Marvel's hometown.
Yeah.
Game Hold Con is another one I never miss, which is in Madison, Wisconsin, on usually the third weekend in October. So October 20th through 23rd. That's a fantastic show too, if you get a chance to go to that one. I generally stick to shows either where somebody brings me out or it's local stuff.
Yeah.
Right. And Gen Con's my only exception. I just always go to Gen Con. Even if they told me I couldn't go to Gen Con, I would find a fake ID and a mask and a beard, a cheap goatee, and work, cheat my way in somehow. But
make yourself look like someone else.
They will carry me out of Gen Con feet first. That's how it's going to happen. So.
And your website is forbeck.com?
Yes, assuming it's still up. I actually got a notice just before we went on. It said, your website's down. Then it was, your website's up. I'm like, well, okay. Yeah.
Well, it was up all day today when I saw it.
Good.
When I was double checking.
Forbeck.com, Forbeck.com. You can find me on Twitter at mforbeck. You can find me on Facebook at Forbeck, I think.
/Forbeck.
There you go. And Instagram, I'm, I think, mforbeck there as well. So
Indeed. Awesome. Well,
and I'm friendly and don't bite very hard, so it's okay.
So everybody go and say hello to Matt when you're at any of those events.
Exactly. Oh, please do, actually. I mean, that's a lot of the fun. This is how I learned how to be very tough about playtesting. I came out with a game called Brave New World, which was a superhero role-playing game back in 1999. And I remember I was at a convention, I think in St. Louis, and a fan buttonholed me and told me in excruciatingly painful detail what I had done wrong by his beats for like a half hour. And I'm like, Yeah, okay, fine. Go. Thanks. After all, you're like, it's let me buy the game from you. I'm going to burn it. It's okay. That one copy, we're just going to get rid of. But people pay their money. They want to be able to express themselves in that. I'm not paid to listen, but I am, as part of what I do, I want the game to be better, right? And that's
Right.
why we're doing the public play test like this. So if you guys want to give me feedback on though, Marvel does have a place for you to give that. It's marvel.com/RPG. Go there. They actually have an official place they want to do that. I really am not going out there wandering around asking for a lot of advice directly on the game, because Marvel's got a lot of very expensive lawyers that they want to make sure that people go through the website, because when you do that, you sign a waiver saying, if you give us an idea, you're not going to sue us at some point for saying,
Right.
yeah, you're right, we should have added a +3 instead of a +4 to that, right? So um,
So go to their official
we're not trying to
thing and
steal from
fill
you,
out.
but there's going to be probably 100 people that give us the same kind of feedback for 1,000 people.
Right.
And we need to be able to use that freely without having people say they stole that. Give it to us freely. We would appreciate that. Honestly, I would appreciate it too.
Well, and then when you see it, you can just be like, "Oh, I wrote that in," and just be happy that it
Exactly.
got in. That it got
And
fixed.
lie, tell everybody you did that part, and I won't argue. So
There we go.
and it could be true. I mean, we're probably going to get the same feedback from 10, 15 different people or whatever.
Right.
And we really are looking for that. I mean, I try to be humble about this, because a game design, again, is an iterative process where you really don't know how it's going to work out until it meets the fan base, until it meets the player base, right? You can test it as many times as you want to at home. I usually start out just by myself playing around the table, right? And I move on to playing with my kids, and I move on to playing with my friends outside the house. And then we do cold play testing where we send it out to people who've never seen it before. And then we go wide like we do now. It's a long process. By the time you guys have seen it, it's gone through several steps already. Doesn't mean it's perfect. We know that. So give us the feedback and let us know where it's not perfect and what you love about it.
Awesome. And we'll have to have you come back so you can talk more with us about some of your other stuff. We didn't get to talk about shotguns and sorcery. We didn't get to talk about your Endless Quest D&D stuff. We didn't get to talk about some of your other novels, Brave New World, we just briefly mentioned. So we'll have to have you back to talk about all of that stuff, and maybe if there's more developments on the Marvel RPG system, we'll have to have you back for
I'm
that.
sure there will be for years to come. So
there we go. Ladies and gentlemen, May 30th, we're joined by author, editor, writer Erin Evans. She wrote D&D's Brimstone Angels series, God Cataclysm, and others, as well as her work with the Idle Champions video game, and you can see her on Twitch's Dungeon Scrawlers channel. So that'll be May 30th. June 13th, it's our anniversary episode, and we're going to be joined by urban fantasy author Hunter Blaine. He wrote the Preternatural Chronicles, which is a really amazing urban fantasy story. Main character is the last vampire on the world. So make sure you tune in June 13th for that. Also, be sure to subscribe to the show and get future episodes notified to you. Also, make sure to rate and review the show. It means a lot, and it helps us and helps our guests. And that's what's really important. So, for Matt Forbeck, I'm Nick Sampson. Thank you for listening to Epic Realms.